and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So if you've been following with us the last few episodes, you'll know I've taken some time to delve into what I've called the battle for the soul of Plato. This startlingly bitter controversy, not so much as started really, but more reignited in the 1950s by scholars at Germany's University of Tübingen over the idea of Plato having these esoteric teachings, what I've referred to as a kind of mathematical mysticism. You could equally call it, I guess, a kind of mystical mathematics that provide a kind of ultimate explanation of reality, and that he taught within the walls of his academy rather than writing about explicitly in his dialogues. That Plato was, in a way, a kind of closet mystic. There are a number of reasons why I felt it worthwhile to explore this controversy, some of which I'll get into later in this series. But one of them, actually, as paradoxical as this may sound, is because I wanted to show that there's a sense in which this debate, for all the animosity that went into it, is in some sense a red herring, at least, or especially for one of our purposes in this series. And I'll get into what I mean by all that. There are actually two reasons why I think the debate over the Tübingen theory doesn't matter much in that sense. And I think the first one I'm going to mention to you might be the most surprising. First, I think it might not hurt for us to back up a bit here. We've ended up going down this road of discussing the controversy over the Tübingen school, when from the beginning our goal was to talk about how Platonic love can change your life. And we've gone down this road of going through all these scholarly articles and books, all because way back in the symposium, Plato told us through the prophetess Diotima that all humans desire is nothing but the good itself. This is what she once told Socrates, and what Socrates told in turn to his fellow guests at the symposium or drinking party held in honor of the playwright Agathon. And I don't know if that would have caused them to spit out their wine a little bit, because it does seem subversive to me on the most profound level. So we had to wonder what exactly Plato means when he says the good, and this led us to his Republic, in which he rather surprisingly called it the principle or ultimate cause of everything. And we discovered that, rather disappointingly, he never explains in his dialogues in any sort of upfront way why he believes this to be the case about the good. This makes it harder for us to understand what he means by the good, and in turn makes it harder to understand what Diotima meant when she said all desire is for the good. And so this led us to look into how modern day scholars have tried to make sense of Plato's rather cryptic treatment of the good. But this didn't seem to bring us to any easy answers either. We discovered that they've basically come up with 4 different ways of explaining Plato here. We saw how the great Paul Shorey, writing way back in 1932, dismissed as quite irrelevant one of these 4, the possibility that Plato may have understood by this term the good, the unity of being, or put in the terms of Greek philosophy, the one, ta hen, the whole of subjective and objective reality as one. But Shorey's skepticism was hard for us to square with the number of pieces of evidence brought forward by the Tübingen school, including the words of Aristotle, Plato's student for 20 years. In his Metaphysics, Aristotle wrote that Plato had taught that the one was the principle of all things and the cause of good. And so this decades-long battle ensued over whether Plato had some sort of secret or semi-secret teaching, this sort of mathematical mysticism, the core idea of which was that the good is the one. And so I think it is surprising, in a way, as I mentioned earlier, to learn that what ultimately separates the anti-Tübingen from the Tübingen position can be seen in a way as actually quite small. So small even as to be almost insignificant, especially for our purposes as we explore the theme of this series, how Platonic love can change your life and what he may have meant by the good. Strange to think of for such a hard-fought controversy, isn't it? And yet, my evidence for saying this comes from one of the most strident opponents of the school. I'm talking about Wolfgang Rainer Mann, the Columbia scholar whose 2006 paper, so strongly anti-Tübingen, I drew so heavily from last time. Toward the end of the very same paper, and I didn't mention this last time because I wanted to save it up for today, toward the very end of that paper, Mann argues that it's in fact quite plausible that the mathematical mysticism they talked about really was Plato's teaching on principles, on the ultimate causes of everything. It was quite possible that this teaching really was at the heart of his philosophy. And here's Mann on this. There is ... because I cut some stuff out here. No reason for us to take seriously the idea that the Prinzipienlehre, that's in German the teaching on principles, no reason for us to take seriously the idea that the Prinzipienlehre, or something like it, was systematically excluded from the dialogues. On the contrary, recent work on, say, the Republic and the Philebus, that's another Platonic dialogue, shows in detail the relevance of Greek mathematics and musical theory, which is also mathematical, of course, for understanding the role of principles within those dialogues. And one of the works that Mann seems to be referring to here is a book called Plato's Late Ontology, a riddle resolved, published in 1983 and written by Kenneth Sayre, a professor at Notre Dame who actually died just a couple of years ago in 2022. Sayre had a rather unique background that spanned mathematics and information science, including artificial intelligence, as well as ancient philosophy. Anyway, one of the things Sayre does in that book is try to show that Plato's Philebus ends subtly pointing to the conclusion that the one and the good are the same. To return to Mann's paper. He says, nor is there reason to think that the central claim of the lecture on the good, and I have to interrupt him again here, but you might remember that's the lecture Plato supposedly gave in which he argued that the good is the one. Nor is there reason to think that the central claim of the lecture on the good is excluded from the dialogues. If that claim is understood as, so he says there's two different ways of understanding that claim. If that claim is understood as the form of the good is one, i.e. the form of the good forms a kind of unity, we need look no further afield than the Republic. And you might remember that in books 6 and 7 of the Republic, Plato talks about goodness existing as a pure idea, the form of the good, this one form that is the principle of both thought and reality. This deep and mysterious idea, conscious expanding, I think, of goodness as a kind of sun that illuminates everything, in a way bringing thoughts and things into existence through this act of illumination. To return again to Mann and repeat what he just said. If that claim is understood as, quote, the form of the good is one, unquote, i.e. the form of the good forms a kind of unity, we need look no further afield than the Republic. If, as is perhaps more likely, the claim should be understood as, quote, the good is the one, unquote. And personally, I'm not really convinced these are really two separate claims, but anyway. Then reading the Republic and the Parmenides is another Platonic dialogue, will prompt for even moderately intelligent readers something like the following train of thought. Mann writes, in the Republic, Plato had identified the good as the highest form or ultimate principle, as that on which everything else depends. In the Parmenides, the one seems to play a similarly preeminent role, in that if anything fails to participate in the one, it fails to be one, and thus runs the risk of, in a way, not being anything at all, a result deemed obviously unacceptable. But arguably, there cannot be two highest forms or two first principles. I don't understand again why Mann says arguably here, but anyway. Thus one might well wonder, is the one supposed to be subordinated to the good or vice versa? Or are the one and the good somehow the same? Again, if they're both supposed to be first highest forms or first principles, I don't see how one could be subordinated to the other. So to me, this question of Mann's of whether they are somehow the same seems answerable, obviously, in the affirmative. But anyway, this, I must say, both startled and fascinated me. At nearly the end of a 50-page stream of hostility and sometimes kind of tasty invective, at the end of all this hostility against the Tübingen school, Mann ends up conceding, in my view, the core of what these people are arguing for. I don't think in his mind it's a concession. His point here is to argue against this idea that the one and the good are the same as esoteric, as something Plato communicated only orally to students within the walls of his academy. But the Tübingen position, as I see it, isn't arguing that this teaching doesn't appear anywhere in any form in the dialogues. Its argument rather is that this teaching isn't explicitly in them in the same way, for example, that his theory of the forms is, where he goes into quite a bit of depth, explaining the ins and outs, and in many different dialogues. This doesn't mean that in their view, Plato's view of the one and the good being the same isn't communicated in the dialogues at all. I don't think that's what the Tübingen school is saying. In fact, I think they spend a lot of time and energy trying to prove that it's hinted at and can be inferred from the dialogues, which is precisely what Mann does here. To me, he seems to all but come full circle and meet them. To put this another way, to me what Mann, and I think many of the opponents of the Tübingen school have done, perhaps without knowing it, is to build something like a straw man argument. They're attacking this idea that Plato's teaching on the principles of his philosophy, chiefly this idea that the good is the one, doesn't appear in the dialogues. But I don't see this as being really what the Tübingen school is arguing. In fact, they see shades and echoes, hints and allusions of this doctrine all through the dialogues. They see it subtly shaping how Plato wrote them. And I must say, I agree with them in that. One thing I found about the idea of the good being the one in Plato is that once you've first caught this idea, you can't really unsee it. When you return to reading the dialogues, you find you're noticing all sorts of things that could be allusions to it, not to mention Plato saying, well, we've talked about this some other time, or we'll talk in more detail about this later. And so I think this sharp dichotomy, this way of phrasing the question in stark terms of whether this teaching is in or not in the dialogues, and meaning by in the dialogues that they must appear there explicitly, is not really helpful. It's in them implicitly, perhaps not too differently even from how a poem's theme appears in it. And we know that I certainly think it's undeniable that Plato's dialogues are works of literature just as much as they're works of philosophy. And I doubt he saw the distinction as being that important. I'd also like to say something on a related topic. I also mentioned last episode one other element of the Tübingen interpretation that seems to particularly bother its opponents, this question of whether and how Plato actually did explicitly communicate his thoughts on the principles, these ultimate causes I've been talking about. I think this is another thing we here at Platonic Soul can kind of get past. Though the idea of secret teaching does have this kind of Dan Brownish appeal, as I mentioned a couple of episodes ago. And it's interesting historically. It's always interesting to learn about how ancient schools and ancient religious societies worked. It's not a huge concern of ours, I don't think, to what extent Plato's teaching on his principles were secret or at least not actively publicized beyond a small group of followers. Our main concern, as I mentioned earlier, is to figure out what Plato through Diotima meant by saying all eros is for the good. It seems to me that scholars in the academy have been losing their interest in this question also. In his 1983 book that I mentioned earlier, Sayre notes that the question of what to make of Plato's supposed lecture on the good, quote, has come in recent years to constitute a major industry of Platonic studies and has generated one of the more spirited controversies in contemporary philosophy. But he adds that he has no desire to become enmeshed in the debate. Both arguments, he writes, have strengths and weaknesses, and attempting to prove or disprove either would take an enormous amount of time. And so he focuses in his book, Plato's Late Ontology, on trying to show how the Philebus seems to point to this conclusion that the good and the one are identical. And he anticipates that doing so will deflate or be deflationary to the conflict by pushing somewhat toward irrelevancy the question of how Plato communicated this idea to other people. The important thing, after all, is what he actually thought. In a much more recent book, Platonism and Naturalism, published in 2020, University of Toronto professor Lloyd Gerson says something similar. Quote, I do not maintain that the oral teachings make up some secret doctrine unrelated to that which is found in the dialogues. On the contrary, the dialogues give us ample evidence for the content of the oral teachings as attested by Aristotle. And Aristotle's attestation, of course, is this idea that Plato taught that the one and the good were the same. And Gerson spends much of his book arguing for that conclusion also, based on what is in the dialogues. So anyway, that's the first reason why I think that, in a sense, all this controversy over the Tübingen position is actually not all that important to us, in a sense. The second reason is perhaps less surprising, but at least as important, probably more so. That's what I'd like to talk about next week, and I hope you can join me then. And one more thing. I say that, in a sense, the controversy over the Tübingen position isn't important to us. There's another sense, I think, in which it is. Not because it need play a role in helping us decide whether by the good Plato meant the one or not, but because of what it says about the Platonic system and about our own time. And so I believe that this controversy reveals something about us, and I think self-awareness is always a good thing. But I'll be getting into that in a later episode. Until next week, be well, and thanks for watching.